Now you have an opportunity to ask questions. I can see a question over there. Iram, please.
Iram Cherry from the Center for Business Taxation. My question is for Sophie, Katherine, and Amy about routine and residual returns. Is there consensus and common understanding within your circles and across between about these terms? And I guess Amy did refer to there not being one, but perhaps what are at least the common aspects of these?
Sorry, any other questions? Yes, please, over there at the top row.
Dominic Masson from RELX. You mentioned that there were lots of challenges there, and there certainly were at the start of the presentation, but I actually thought that was quite an optimistic end to the presentation, and I was particularly taken by the J&J approach, which felt like it was actually rooted in some kind of practical reality, by contrast perhaps to some of the more academic things we heard about in the morning. I guess taking it a step further, I wonder, and Amy mentioned you have a situation where you're selling in 180 countries, but you are only have a taxable presence in 70. The risk of any of these approaches is you end up having to have some kind of approach to collecting taxes in lots more jurisdictions than you're currently present. So I wondered whether, if you took the J&J type approach, whether that might lend itself actually to a low value withholding tax as a mechanism for collecting in those remote jurisdictions.
Any other questions? Yes, Philip.
Philip Baker, I guess from Oxford, actually. Just a comment to Itai. Itai, there is another possibility that rests between your second and third alternatives there, and that is to have a true multilateral instrument, but which is then implemented by bilateral arrangements. You don't seem to...
I've thought about this. It's your idea with Jeffrey Owens from 10 years ago, yeah.
No. Linking me with Jeffrey Owens probably kills the idea completely. It was actually John Avery Jones there. No, actually, there is one model of it. It never went into force, but there's a multilateral instrument on copyright royalty, taxation of copyright royalties, which UNESCO promoted a number of years ago. That contains a multilateral instrument binding between the members, which contains definitions that are generally agreed, principles that are agreed, approaches to the relief of double taxation, and limits the options available to countries. There is then a protocol which sets out a draft model bilateral convention where pairs of countries then call off the agreement by implementing it, making choices between themselves that are most appropriate. That particular convention, in a sense, didn't need to go into force because it's implemented equally through bilateral conventions, but I do recommend having a look at it as an interesting existing pattern. I did a little note on it in the British Tax Review about 3 or 4 months ago, and put it forward as a possible alternative which sits between a truly binding multilateral instrument, but retains the bilateralism which we saw from the original MLI countries very much wanted to maintain.
Thank you. Any other questions in this round? If not, we will then just allow panelists to respond. All right, so I suggest you start maybe with Katherine and Amy, and then go back to Itai and Sophie.
Okay. So I think the first question was a good one. Is there a common understanding of what is routine and what is residual? And I would say, theoretically, I think yes, but practically, I think the answer is no. It's all about really what you determine to be your value drivers. And so we might say that marketing intangibles, for example, are something that has to be split in the residual profit, maybe as opposed to manufacturing intangibles, maybe as opposed to complex manufacturing. But at the end of the day, I've seen a lot of models, and frankly, at J&J, we use the residual profit split method all the time, mostly because we have multiple IP funding and a lot of very big risks, particularly in our pharma and medical device space. You might decide in one model that 30% of marketing spend is value added. And so your routine returns are going to be 70% of your marketing spend with a cost plus on it. You might decide that for particular areas that this is really something that is not involving marketing intangibles, and therefore there's just a markup on SG&A, local distributor returns. I would say that we have a lot of audits on this particular area, and they're not typically about how we actually split the residual profit. They are mostly focused on how we got the routine returns. And that question keeps coming up as to how did you decide that 30% of this was residual and 70% of this was regular marketing spend? How can you support those numbers? Why isn't it the same number in the next model that we're looking at? And so I think the idea that a common understanding, I think, yes, at a theoretical level, we understand the difference, particularly in multinational corporations. I really don't think that practically we're very good at actually doing the work that needs to be done. And I think the second question was sort of on the expansion of territories, and I must say that we have the same issue as Procter & Gamble, in that we say that we market in more than 200 companies, but we only have about 70 countries that we actually have legal entities in. And so the question that came up earlier today about the limits of where this would apply to are critically important. And I think determining really what the value of the users and the value of the, let's say in the digital economy, the inputs that users give on something like Facebook, we really need to figure out if that's the right end to this point, or whether we need to be thinking about this in a broader basis. And if so, where does it stop, right? I mean, if we have a company that does Komatsu, let's say, that does industrial machinery, and produces a new tractor, and that tractor gets sold to Argentina, and Argentina sells that to another third party in Brazil. Are we now taxable in Brazil because the sale of our product is happening in a particular country, even though there's no related party arrangement there? So I think that's an important point.
Yeah. I would just add on the routine versus residual question. I think we have figured it out in our APAs. We have lots of APAs, but it's the same. We recognize the same thing. It's the fight in often market jurisdictions is about the routine return, and so you still have fights over that one. So I think that's why we're here, because I think there is a path towards better certainty.
Thank you, Itai, please.
Unless, Sophie, do you want to? So a few observations in no order on the various questions. The low value withholding tax, that would be a low value withholding tax on goods or services that are cross-border. That would be a tariff. Assuming the WTO survives the Trump administration, that would be illegal internationally. Separately, it's tariffs are not a good idea. There's like a big literature that economics has produced for a long time about that. Separately, on the what I guess is called the mushing point, I have lots of sympathy for the points made by the companies when they explain why they think that some version of non-mushing, either regional or by product line, or cutting out the residence country jurisdiction might make some sense. But if you do any of those things, you need a true multilateral treaty. Only the true mushing can work in MLI+, the full mush. I don't know how else to describe it. Otherwise, you're in a multilateral treaty, and everyone should get that, and then think about the political consequence of that now and not when it's too late and you've put yourself in the place where you need a multilateral treaty, but you can't agree one, which would be an unfortunate result. And so I'm cautioning about it. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Itai. And Sophie, maybe a few words.
Yes, just to reiterate what Amy and Katherine have said about the where we are in terms of routine versus non-routine the issue is more one of a practice, and as Richard mentioned, the solution has to be simple and not rely on the difficult delineation between routine and non-routine in practice. So. And my other comment is on the multilateral approach. I think what is key is to come up to a solution first and then have all of the options thoroughly examined in order to have an implementation that will make sense. There's pros and cons in each of the approaches. But when you have a multilateral approach, I think that what Philip mentioned, what the appeal to that is the flexibility that a broad consensus in a legal instrument would do, allowing from some flexibility in the detailed implementation of those broad principles. So I think that the program of work is open and invite delegate to look at all of the options and pick the one that will make the most sense. But indeed, we have to look at what is to be implemented first and see what makes sense then.
I want to add one more thing. So let's say we get to the point where we agree that we shouldn't do full mush. So now we're in multilateral treaty, okay? So if we're in multilateral treaty, because we're not doing full mush, we're gonna need reporting rules for how to disaggregate the full mush. We have a system that already requires some kind of reporting that is then circulated globally. It's called country-by-country reporting. We've learned that it sort of works and sort of doesn't work. But one thing about it is that those numbers are not particularly sensitive to the residence country tax administration that has to audit them. On the other hand, they don't have definitive consequences. In a world where you went down multilateral treaty with business line segmentation, for example, you would have numbers that would presumably need to be reported and presumably would be reported to the parent of the residence country jurisdiction and would have consequences. In particular, there would be a particular number US MNCs would be reporting to the IRS, where if it was higher, France gets more, and if it was lower, France gets less. And the tax administration that gets to decide whether to audit the number is the United States Internal Revenue Service. And the question is whether that's okay. And if not, whether the OECD is going to create a multilateral tax auditing service. Because that's the alternative. And I think that these things also have to get sorted out. You want to be careful when you leave the full mush and think through the consequences.
Thank you to all. Do we have any other questions? We have 3 minutes. Yes, please. Over there. On the right. Any other questions so that I see how many we have?
A new title for your paper.
The full mush.
Peter Faherty from HMRC. Just an observation, really, on the kind of issues about attributing value to the kind of market or to the IP, which is that, of course, the value of the IP and the results of the research and development is magnified because you can sell it in 70 countries. So, it doesn't actually seem kind of unreasonable to say, actually, the profits arising from those sales in those countries and the taxation of those profits should include what's derived from the IP, considering it's the ability to sell that gives you that extra value. The IP would be much less valuable if you could only sell it in America.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think nobody wants to stand between you and the coffee. So I suggest we get responses from the panelists, or maybe some comments, if any, in this, and then this will close.
I can just respond to that. I think that there is, for a multinational, they wouldn't exist if there wasn't some benefit to having scale, right? So it can't just be all about the IP. And I think that's why, again, why we're here talking about an enhanced return to the market or enhanced distributor return, because there might be something more there, but we need to talk about what that is, and it should be something modest.
I guess my last comments would be simple, certain, and keep the arm's length standard in place for the rest of the supply chain.
No. Thank you very much again.